Everybody, thank you so much for being here this evening. My name is Dr. Nick Literski. You probably got that from the ad. I'm a professor of depth psychology and creativity. And because I work at a school that is very open-minded, my specialty happens to be magic as it intersects with depth psychology and the work of Carl Jung. I am currently working on a book examining Carl Jung in terms of magic. Many of his writings show little breadcrumbs of his involvement with ceremonial magic, and it's turning out to be a fascinating story. So to jump in here, first let's do a little context. Eliphas Levi, the mastermind really behind the French occult revival, died May 31st, 1875. 2 months later, Carl Jung is born. A few months later, Aleister Crowley is born. So I show this just to give you an idea of timing and where these folks actually sort of line up in the greater scheme of calendars and such. Now, Jung's grandfathers were both kind of interesting influences on the family and indirectly to him. Both passed before he was born, but again, their legacies go on. Carl Gustav Jung, his grandfather on his father's side, was actually the Grand Master of Freemasons in Switzerland, in what they called the Albino Lodge, which was their form of Freemasonry. He was also a surgeon, a very gifted medical doctor and professor, but he passed down these ideas of Freemasonry at a time in Germany when fringe Freemasonry, so-called, was sort of popular. What that really means is Freemasonry with an esoteric and magical interest. Samuel Preiswerk, his mother's father, was a minister, and Samuel Preiswerk was the head of the Church of Switzerland, but he also was an accomplished spiritist. He claimed to have many visions, and he would go into a room in his home every Sunday evening and lock himself in with nobody else around, and he would proceed to talk to the dead. So, as you see from this, there are these influences. Jung's mother actually carried on that sort of mediumistic tendency, and actually it sort of scared Carl Jung as a child because his mother was uncanny. She would predict things and say things that made everybody a little nervous. So this is his mother, and actually I'm gonna go. Okay, that's fine. So Emily Preiswerk, like I said, was sort of clairvoyant, was something of a medium. And at one point, Carl Jung, at age 15, was already becoming really disillusioned with organized religion. He'd had a really disappointing experience of his first communion, where he expected something to really happen, and it was a big nothing. And so this got him digging into his father's theological library. His father was a minister. And he was smart enough at the age of 15 to look at these theological books and say, what they're writing here doesn't hold water. It doesn't give satisfying answers. And so it put him into a little bit of a depression, if you will, as he was wrestling with this. In his mind, as he tells it years later, he was quiet about this. Now, a little bit of observant mother, perhaps, a little bit of mother's intuition. Emily Preiswerk, out of the blue, according to Jung, no warning whatsoever, says, you ought to read Goethe's Faust. So, quick primer. The Faust legend is based on an actual individual who was born in the late 15th or early 16th century. He earned a doctorate in theology at Wittenberg, studied law, medicine, alchemy, and magic. He died between 1539 and 1541, and just kind of placed things. He was a contemporary of Martin Luther. In fact, Martin Luther came to the same school to teach after Faust was gone, and heard of Faust's death, which, by the way, was an alchemical accident gone wrong. He blew himself up in his house. And Martin Luther said, well, good, he's gone on to the devil who he served. But in any case, the Faust legend, within a few years, begins to take on much larger scale. And he becomes more and more fabulous as a magician. He really becomes the German version, if you will, of King Solomon. He is that much an archetypal magician in the German culture. So Jung read the story of Faust, which in a nutshell is Faust becoming very frustrated with all his book learning and feeling it's not giving him the answers in life. And so he enters into a pact with Mephistopheles, who, by the way, is not the devil, contrary to what some people say, but actually a devil. And begins on a quest of knowledge and experience that eventually will land his soul in hell. As it happens, he has a change of character over time and eventually takes the riches that he has obtained and starts to build a utopian society, a utopian community. And because of his good works and his good intentions, and also the intervention of his dearly loved Gretchen, who had passed on long before, Faust is forgiven and brought into heaven, and the devil does not get his due. This bothered Jung. Jung felt that Faust was an idiot to enter into an agreement like this and should have gotten his dessert. The reason I bring this up is the Faust legend becomes formative for Jung. It follows him, it haunts him throughout his entire life. Even very late in life, he says that he identifies with Faust. And he feels that he carries the sin of Faust, somehow needs to be redeemed. As he goes on, he becomes interested in paleontology. He becomes interested in Egypt and Mesopotamia. And he's thinking of being an archaeologist. Unfortunately, he realizes there's no money in that, and his family has very little money. So he's got to do something meaningful. He goes to school at the University of Basel and ultimately becomes a medical doctor. His medical doctoral thesis was actually the study of his cousin, Helene Prey's work. Now, at that time in history, we had some different ethical standards. Today, you would not be able to study a family member as part of your doctoral dissertation, nor would you be able to study your cousin who was madly in love with you and wanted to marry you. But the result was his thesis on the psychology and pathology of so-called occult phenomena in 1902. And this is the beginning of Jung trying to reconcile science and spirituality. And it's a quest that he's going to be on throughout his life. And Magick typifies it. Magick is writ large on this quest, if you will. He is in a time when psychology, and particularly psychotherapy, is struggling to obtain relevance and respect in larger academia. And so there's a lot of political maneuvering going on to make sure that it's taken seriously. What this meant for Jung is that the more empirical aspect of his personality, as opposed to mystical, takes the lead. He wants to make sure that everything he is doing is evidence-based and that he can say he's an empiricist. That is a bit of an illusion, even to him. But he tries. And really, like I said, I think he's trying to really reconcile these two things. At the same time here, we have the German occult revival. And I remember I talked about Elvis Levi being really the mastermind behind the French occult revival. German occult revival came just a little bit later, between 1880 and 1910. Some of the really major aspects of that sort of drove it forward was first the establishment of Theosophy in July 1884 within Germany. This led to Rudolf Steiner becoming very active in the Theosophy community. But eventually, his ideas became very unwelcome. And it caused a split in the community. And he founded what he called Anthroposophy. And as it happened, when that split occurred, many German theosophists actually followed Steiner. By 1895, which, mind you, this is when Jung is 20, Ordo Templi Orientis is first established in the work of Theodor Reuss and others in Germany. So we already have the beginning of esoteric societies and a renewal of these ideas. By this time, there is an extensive literature connected to Faust of magical grimoires. Some of them are very similar to Solomonic grimoires that we're used to in other parts of Europe, Some of them were very different in some ways, but they're fascinating, really exciting stuff to look through. In any event, this corpus is beginning to gather relevance again. So Jung in 1906 meets Sigmund Freud, and the relationship between these two is a book in itself, literally. It's Freud, like I said, was very wrapped up in this political question of trying to make psychoanalysis respected. It was complicated by the fact that Freud was Jewish in a time of rampant anti-Semitism, and he was very worried that psychoanalysis would be seen as a Jewish psychology and therefore marginalized. So when he begins corresponding with Jung, and Jung takes an interest in his work, he gets very excited. They begin to collaborate for several years. And Freud goes so far as to call Jung his crown prince. There's a lot of really dynamic father figure, son figure dynamics going on here. It gets really strange over time. And eventually they have a terrible falling out. But one thing I want to highlight on this is 1909, Jung is sitting in the home of Sigmund Freud. And they would sit there and have discussions way into the wee part of the morning. As they're talking about psychokinetic powers and parapsychology, Freud begins to actually just ridicule Jung. In fact, he calls this Jung's spook complex, because again, he's really worried about these mystical things getting in the way of respectability. So as we are sitting there, Jung begins to become angry. And the way he describes it is like a red hot iron in the pit of his stomach. And this pressure, this energy just builds up. And all of a sudden, one of the bookshelves in Freud's office emits a huge loud crack, startles them both, and really freaks out. Well, Jung says, well, there is an example of a so-called catalytic exteriorization phenomenon. I hate that he uses those fancy words. What he really means is, I got pissed, and look what happened. It was manifest in the world around me. Freud, oh come, that's sheer bosh. Freud didn't let up. He said, oh no, I'm right, and it's going to happen again. Boom. It immediately happened again. And this may have been one of the occasions where Freud actually fainted in Jung's presence. So within 4 years, by 1913, this relationship deteriorates to the point where it is no longer tenable. And it's becoming so insulting back and forth that Jung actually withdraws and says, I want nothing to do with you. That break of this close bond and this close working relationship really messed with Jung. It put him in a sense of depression. It had him concerned about his own mental health for a time. And what he finally began to do was pay attention to the fantasy images that came up in his own mind. He was already an accomplished psychoanalyst, and so he knew that these needed to be taken seriously. And as scary as it was, he allowed himself to sink into that process, unaided. Now, psychoanalysis is a companioned process. You have an analyst who holds your hand through this. Jung is doing this on his own. And he knows that that's risky. He knows that that's scary, but he feels he has no other choice. So Jung encounters a feminine figure that he calls his soul, and understands that to be his soul. And she begins to challenge many of his ideas. She promises to dive into the depths and bring forward things for him to learn. And she says, will you accept whatever I bring you? And he says, yes, I have no right to deny it. So she dives in. She comes back. She says, I find painted stones, carved bones of magical signs, talismanic sayings on hanks of leather and small plates of lead, dirty pouches filled with teeth, human hair, and fingernails, timbers lashed together, black orbs, moldy animal skins, all the superstitions hatched by dark prehistory. And Jung is writing about this. Now, remember, Jung is dealing with his own psyche. So this kind of tells you what his attitudes were. And this becomes all the more powerful because soul dives into the depths again. I find the treasures of all past cultures, magnificent images of gods, spacious temples, paintings, papyrus rolls, sheets of parchment with the characters of bygone languages, books full of lost wisdom, hymns and chants of ancient priests, stories laid down by ages through generations upon generations. This has Jung's respect. By this time, the Greek magical papyri is already in translation. So that is very likely a piece of what Jung pictured in this inner journey, if you will. But it also shows his somewhat classist attitudes. Jung may have come from a family that didn't have much money, but he married very well. Emma, his wife, had a significant dowry, if you will. And what it did was it gave Jung the ability to begin building his practice and do his research instead of having to earn money. And so he was able to spend the time diving into these things. So this is where Jung begins his exploration of magic. And these are things that show up in what you may have heard of as the Red Book. When Jung's going through these experiences, he keeps small notebooks that he calls his Black Book. It's actually 7 little volumes, a couple of which are actually brown, but that's the name he gives it. It's significant, I think, because all those Faustian grimoires that I told you about that are all over in the culture, they are called the Black Books. So it gives you an idea, again, what's floating around for Jung. So after this experience of soul, he calls on this image of soul again the next night. And she says, "Will you accept whatever I give you?" And he says, "Yes." She offers him a rod, a black serpent, a black rod carved like a serpent, with 2 pearls as eyes, a fine gold bangle around its neck. Is it not a magical wand? And this is actually a recreation, if you will, that I worked with another magician to produce, because many of the images that Jung saw in his visions are either painted or sculpted, and this one he did not touch, partly because it frankly frightened him. That said, this was really a common image. Many of us are familiar with the story of Moses in the Old Testament, and where the Egyptian priests threw down their staffs that became serpents. He threw down his staff, became a serpent that ate their serpents. But these serpent-shaped rods are really common in ancient Egypt. These are a couple of them that have been found. One of them was specifically found in the tomb of a priest whose name was recorded as the keeper of secrets. So Jung is very much afraid of this rod, because it is not just a rod, it is a gift of magic. And the idea of magic scares him. Why? Because he's trying to be an empiricist. He's trying so hard not to give in to the mystical. So Soul begins to have an ongoing exchange with him. She offers him magic in the form of the black rod, and he complains and whines a little. "Well, what should I do with magic? Magic will do a lot for you. I'm afraid that you're stirring up my desire and misunderstanding. You know that man never stops craving the black art and things that cost no effort," which anybody who practices magic can chuckle at, right? Soul responds, "Magic is not easy and it demands sacrifice. The sacrifice that magic demands is solace." And Jung is torn by that term solace. He's afraid that this is going to cut him off from all of humanity and actually make him some sort of a hermit. If we get on a little further, his understanding of that term solace clears up. He continues with Soul. "But I don't dare to believe in magic, or maybe I have a completely false idea of it. Be patient, my science has not yet been overcome." Soul says, "High time you overcame it." Soul is snarky, and I love it. "You ask a great deal, almost too much. After all, is science essential to life? Is science life? There are people who live without science, but to overcome science for the sake of magic, that sounds uncanny and menacing. Uncanny being the same word he uses to describe his mother and how much she scared him. Are you afraid? Don't you want to risk life? Isn't it life that presents you with this problem? So this is Jung's introduction, really, to magic in a very personal way, other than what he knows about the Faust legend, this sort of thing. Jung begins over time to collect a substantial library of grimoires. And these are just a few examples. I've made a point of collecting as many as I can of the original editions that he'd had. So with the exception of Agrippa in the center, oh, actually, don't have the lower right one. I just have a reproduction of that one. But the other three are mine. But he begins pulling all these Faustian grimoires. He pulls other grimoires. He is clearly educating himself on magic. He is not choosing books willy-nilly. He's choosing a very well prepared practitioner's library. And this continues for many, many years. You know, some of these books aren't published for quite some time yet in his life. And yet he continues.
Yes. Those the titles? They're hard to read.
Sure. So the top right is in English would be Faust in Story and Legend. The top right is actually the first time that Agrippa was published in German, and it's an excerpt specifically of Kabbalistic material from Agrippa. And then the bottom is from the same series. You'll notice the same blue covers here. It's from a larger series of magical books. He doesn't own the whole series. But this particular set of 3 books down on the bottom right contains things like Agrippa, Peter de Abano, many other famous magicians. Again, he is right on target in terms of preparing a legitimate practitioner's library. All the while saying, I don't believe in magic. So going back to his experiences with what he called active imagination. An active imagination is a matter of working with an image. It could be a dream image. It could be an artistic image. It could just be an image that has appeared in your mind. But treating it as if it were an entity unto itself, with its own motivations, its own autonomy, if you will. It's an other, even though it's reflecting what's within. And active imagination engages that other, and really surprising, amazing things come out of it as these various images do speak to you. And I can tell you from experience, as I've practiced the active imagination, I have had some of these entities tell me things that I never imagined in my life. Very powerful lessons. Having had this encounter with soul, Jung on another night goes and imagines himself walking out into the countryside to find a magician that can instruct him. And he encounters Philemon. Philemon is an aged magician. Jung thinks possibly retired. He's out tending the tulips in his front yard when Jung accosts him. And so recently I heard something about magic that awakened my interest in this bygone practice. Love how it's like, oh, I'm going to downplay this here. I came to you because I heard that you understand the black art. If magic were still taught today at the university, I would have studied it there. But the last college of magic was closed long ago. Today, no professor knows anything more about magic. Happy to say that's changed. I'm just curious to know what you're up to and what magic you're performing. Philemon, this magician figure, does not let Jung off easily. He challenges him even more brutally than Soul did. What do you want? In the past, I've helped people here and there who've been sick and disadvantaged. What exactly did you do? Well, I did it quite simply, with sympathy. Here's another key that Jung knows what he's talking about on the subject of magic. Old man, that sounds comical and ambiguous. It could mean that you help people either by expressing compassion or by superstitious sympathetic means. So he's referring to the sympathetic magic. He understands that concept. Philemon, well, surely it would have been both, which is really kind of an obvious answer in this case. Jung continues, and then he tries to play, again, the empiricist. He tries to play a neutral figure. Whenever I want to learn something, I leave my so-called reason at home and give whatever it is that I'm trying to understand the benefit of the doubt. I've learned this gradually because nowadays the world of science is full of scary examples of the opposite. And after all the hedging that Philemon has done, he says, with this, my boy, you have learned something about magic. Well, I gather from what you're saying that these matters do not follow ordinary understanding, nor does magic. I'm burning to hear even more. What I know up to now is essentially negative. With this, you recognize the second main point. Above all, you must know that magic is the negative of what one can know. The negative of what one can know? I suppose you mean that it cannot be known, don't you? This exhausts my understanding. That is the third point that you must note is essential, namely that there's nothing for you to understand. Well, I must confess that this is new and strange. So nothing at all about magic can be understood? Exactly. Magic happens to be precisely everything that eludes comprehension. So already we have Philemon giving 3 lessons. They're all interrelated, right? They're all this idea that magic cannot be understood. In fact, if it was understood, it would not be magic. And we can look at that in terms of mythology and such and say, sure, because people in so-called superstitious times would blame anything they didn't understand on magic. But Philemon is taking this a little further. Well, Jung says it's difficult to exist without reason, and that is precisely how difficult magic is. I conclude that it is an inescapable condition for the adept, and that he completely unlearns his reason. I'm afraid that's what it amounts to. Ye gods, this is serious. Love that. As they go on, Philemon even goes so far as to say, as to challenge us, do you see the young magicians? And Jung says, well, no, not really. He says, because as old men age, their reason begins to wane. And this is why they become more powerful magicians. Take that for what you will. Jung, having recorded all these things in the Black Book, later on takes excerpts and puts them into what you may have heard of as the Red Book. In doing so, he adds some commentary. And here's what he has to say about this encounter. Magical understanding is what one calls non-comprehension. Everything that works magically is incomprehensible, and the incomprehensible often works magically. One calls incomprehensible workings magical. The magical always surrounds me, always involves me. It opens spaces that have no doors and leads out into the open where there is no exit. The magical is good and evil, and neither good nor evil. This is a reflection years later back on this experience, when he's begun to digest some things. So what I want to do is sort of show you the trajectory of Jung's thought as it goes from this time in 1913 through 1916 on forward in his writings and his career. By 1921, he's beginning to write extensively on archetypes. You may have heard about archetypes. Jung coined the term. And one of these archetypes is the archetype of the magician. And this is what Jung had to say in 1921. The Promethean defiance of the accepted gods is personified in the figure of the medieval magician. The magician has preserved in himself a trace of primitive paganism. He possesses a nature that is still unaffected by the Christian dichotomy and is in touch with the still pagan unconscious, where the opposites lie side by side in their original naive state, beyond the reach of sinfulness, but liable, if assimilated into conscious life, to beget evil as well as good with the same daimonic energy. Whew. A lot of words, right? This is why it takes time to read Jung and start getting his language, because I can tell you when I first started reading Jung, I was completely lost. But let's unpack this a little bit. Prometheus, you know that story. Bringing fire and then being punished for it for decades and eons. But when Jung says then that this is personified in the figure of the medieval magician, who is he talking about? Faust, exactly. The magician has preserved in himself a trace of primitive paganism. So the word primitive, as it shows up in Jung's work, is super problematic. Typical of his time, in white European colonists, Jung basically thinks that anything that's not his religion or his culture is obviously primitive. So when he visits Africa, they are primitive. When he visits the Tao Pueblo community, they are primitive. Anything that differs from the paradigm that he's been raised in, he declares primitive. And that's hugely problematic. In some cases, very racist, especially by today's sponsors. But he was a man of his time. This is to understand his train of thought. He possesses a nature that's still unaffected by the Christian dichotomy and is in touch with the still pagan unconscious. So what does that mean? Pagan thought and belief, as you know, was polytheistic. There was a place for all the different experiences and emotions of life. With the advent of monotheism, you had a problem because that one God had to be good. And you couldn't just be at the mercy of one God without other gods to intervene and such. So psychologically, what happens is people begin to separate all of the shadow or negative aspects of God and press them onto another character, which we know as Satan, as the devil. Interestingly, Satan as the devil is a comparatively recent development. Originally, he was part of the heavenly council. This shows up in Job. And at the same time, the God that shows up in Job is a bit of a bastard. He is perfectly willing to take one of his most loyal and devoted worshipers and subject him to torture just to see what happens. And is in a gamble with Satan. Gives you an idea. And as that book moves on, you start seeing God as a petty, jealous being. Jung later on will write a book called Answer to Job, in which he lays out how the story of Job is a story of God actually progressing psychologically, or what he called individuating. Alongside all of this, there's an idea of what's called participation mystique. And in early stages of humanity, particularly the Paleolithic, researchers and experts believe that humanity existed in what's called participation mystique, that they did not see a sharp distinction between themselves and their environment like we do. One way to typify this is the human infant. Those who study child psychology have concluded that the infant does not understand itself as separate from the mother until some time. And that's actually when the ego begins to develop. So what Jung is saying here is that, back in these primitive times with the pagans, they still lived, these opposites were still side by side in their original naive state. They don't end up being evil or good, because it's all together. It's a participation mystique. There is no division there. And what Jung is saying is that the magician, at least the medieval magician, but I'd argue beyond that, the magician is able to tap into that. The magician is able to realize that there is a connection between all of reality. And that's something that Jung later on will dive into further. By 1923, he gives a really fascinating seminar on psychotherapy in Cornwall, England. And in the process of this, he's talking about various dream images, and he comes up with this. Images are energy or libido. Now, I need to clarify here. Libido has come in our culture to mean sexual energy. That's what Freud labeled it as. Libido in Jungian thought is all psychic energy. All of the things that drive us, all the things that make us alive, as opposed to just sex. That is why the magician makes images, for such things are energy, magic energy. Inasmuch as a figure makes an impression on you, it releases energy. An object that can do that is indeed magic. The magic value of the object exists in certain images. So this is coming from Jung, who has seen Faustian grimoires that are full of magical circles, full of sigils. He knows very well what the magicians are working with. But he's realizing that these things have a psychological impact. And that's what he's trying to focus on. Within a few years, Jung has the opportunity to go to Africa. And it's actually sort of a funny story. He is complaining to a friend that he's overworked, that his clients are getting to him, that he desperately needs a break, that he just can't do that. His friend says, well, hey, I'm leaving for Africa tomorrow morning. Why don't you come with me? And Jung says, oh, no, I can't do that. Well, shortly later at the party, Jung comes back up and says, you know what? I just realized I'm complaining about how I'm overworked and such, and then I am passing up the break. So I think I need to run with this. Jung goes to Egypt. He goes to Africa. He spends a good amount of time touring Africa, but eventually he ends up in Egypt. He spends, depending on how you read the sources, 2 or 3 months in Egypt, touring all of the ancient temples, the pyramids, the mosques, all these various sites, all the museums. He is fully entranced and engulfed in what he has found there. And having just returned from Egypt a week ago, I completely get where he's going. I had the opportunity to stand in places where he did and say, oh, this particular structure is what he's talking about when he says this is in the mosque. So he is very devoted to this. At the same time, he's left his wife Emma at home, and Jung was a polyamorist. Jung had what people recognized in their social circle as his second wife, who was Toni Wolff. Toni Wolff had a bit of a fascination with ancient Egypt. Look at the time period, January 1926. What happened in 1925? The discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb. So the world is on fire with Egyptomania. And this comes into Toni Wolff's picture. But she is working with active imagination, this same process that we talked about. And in active imagination, she invokes, that's the word she uses, she invokes the god Thoth. And Thoth teaches her, because she's home in Switzerland and Jung's in Egypt, how to invite Jung's soul into her own. You Ka of Carl, come here. Move into my heart. Space has been made for you. Your Ba expects you, and you should move in. You look at the structure here. There's multiple calls. The 4th book of occult philosophy actually gives a similar instruction to repeat an invocation 3 times in a kindly voice. Toni Wolff's diary has not been fully released. This is an excerpt that I was able to get access to. I am chomping at the bit. I know who's editing it. He's under a non-disclosure agreement, but he has hinted that I'm going to find a lot more interesting stuff along the lines of what I'm working on. In any event, what this shows is that Toni Wolff was actively following up this pursuit of magical invocation. And even as I've talked with those who have worked with Jung's Red Book and other writings, even Jung himself takes on more of an invocatory tone as his work continues. Early on, it's just, I'm going to sink in and allow. Later on, he's calling upon these images. He's actually invoking them. This picture, Toni Wolff, dressed in Egyptian garb. Again, there's a ton of Egyptomania. Everybody thought it was really cool. She was fascinated with it. And as I recall, this is actually for a costume party. So by 1929, he is writing in his correspondence to another individual. It says, the master speaks a power word, born of the richness of his vision. The disciple merely conjures with it. So think about that distinction for a moment. What he's saying is, the real magician, if you will, has their own power words, has their own ability to call these into being. The conjurer goes and reads the grimoires and follows the directions, follows the recipe. The magical word is one that lets a primordial word resound behind it. Magical action releases primordial action. Take this back to what I said earlier about participation mystique. Primordial being before time. So that power word that the magician is using ties into that eternity, if you will. I might also mention, and I know Eric in the room probably is keying in on those words, power word. Because remember who Jung's paternal grandfather was, the Grand Master of Masons in Switzerland. And this idea of a power word, those who are familiar with Masonic legend are aware of a lost word. So I think there's actually some influence there in how he words this.
The PGM stuff. Maybe think.
Sure, yeah, definitely the PGM, sure. In fact, by this time, he's also getting to other Gnostic writings and things. I'm indeed convinced that the creative imagination is the only primordial phenomenon accessible to us, the real ground of the psyche, the only immediate reality. So let's parse that a little bit. Imagination in depth psychology and in the work of Carl Jung is not pretend. It is the use of image. There was another great scholar who studied Muslim culture, Henri Corbin, and he talks about what he called the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world, and declares that it is just as real as this physical world and as the spiritual world, but it lies between. And so what it's saying is we create by means of making images, by means of imagination. And, I could go on. That's a whole nother talk I could give about how we create gods, about how we create reality by the use of this imaginal capacity. So Jung is saying this is the only thing that actually lets us tap into what the real magician is doing. The only immediate reality. By 1933, he is giving a long series of seminars on, they're all related to one patient who was a remarkable visionary. And he parses out all of her described visions. And in the course of that, he says, I do not believe in magic made by man. Magic is made in Germany or in Great Britain or in America. It does not work. Well, notice that he's not just saying, notice he makes a difference here, a distinction between different parts of the world. Because he knows the literature enough to know that there's a distinction between the German Faustian magic and the Solomonic magic of, say, England, for example. And maybe there's a frustrated magician here. Maybe there's Jung saying, damn it, I couldn't do it, so I don't believe in it. By 1944, it's in an interview, and this is, couched as a wartime interview during World War II. Says you have to get people's confidence before they'll tell you about themselves. But what surprises, things you read about in Paracelsus still exist. I've met sorcerers, spellcasters. Did you know that there are still some places in Bern or St. Gall where they make pacts with the devil and sign them with blood? 1944. That they practice magic on cows? In the Swiss soul, as all human souls, there are regions we do not know about. So notice here that there's a shift going on. There's a maturity. By this time, Jung is in his 60s. He's starting to become that old man that Philman referred to. He's starting to open up a little bit and take a broader, more open mind. And he is having exchanges with people in the countryside who are actively practicing magic. And he realizes something's going on here. A 1947 interview. And this is all, and I apologize, I have a couple text walls in here. He even strayed so far into scientific disrespectability, remember the whole empiricism thing, as to tell us about a magician whom he knows personally, and it was talked freely to him. The man is a Swiss peasant who lives up in the hills above Bollingen, conscientiously practicing his profession. He trusted Dr. Jung and told him willingly many stories of his successes with magic, producing an evidence, a drawer full of testimonials and letters of appreciation from grateful patients. He even brought out his greatest treasure, a book of spells for making magic in the name of Baldur or Venus or of other thoroughly pagan gods. This little volume, believe it or not, he claimed to have been presented to him by a monk. Apparently, Jung is a little unaware of the clerical underground. Apparently, these invocations of highly questionable powers had not disturbed the peace of mind of the good friar in the least. Indeed, magic flourishes, very much as of yore in out-of-the-way places like Switzerland. And not only there, one might add. So again, he is beginning to see a reality in the world that earlier he wanted to deny. This is part of that struggle between empiricism and mysticism. Sorry, one more wall of text. It's a really cool one, I promise. It is. By 1952, Jung introduces a concept called synchronicity. And again, he coined the word, even if you've heard it from other, New Age people or whoever has decided to steal it. But what he is doing is trying to sort out magic. And he comes up with synchronicity as an acausal psychic experience. The idea being that if I have a dream tonight that features an elephant, and I turn on the TV tomorrow, and wouldn't you know it, it's an elephant documentary on the TV. And I go have lunch with Eric, and for some ungodly reason, he starts talking about elephants.
There's only one time.
Okay. Or, various things pop up in the external world that reflect an internal psychic reality. Jung writes this essay introducing the idea of synchronicity. He doesn't actually publish it for several years, but he quotes Albertus Magnus, a magician, in order to support the idea of synchronicity. This is the part he's quoting. I, Albertus Magnus, discovered an instructive account of magic in Avicenna's library's Liber Sextus Naturalium, which says that a certain power to alter things indwells in the human soul and subordinates the other things to her, particularly when she is swept into a great excess of love or hate or the like. When, therefore, the soul of a man falls into a great excess of any passion, it can be proved by experiment that it, the excess, binds things, magically, and alters them in the way it wants. And for a long time, I did not believe it, but after I had read the Negromantic books and others of the kind of science and magic, I found that the emotionality of the human soul is the chief cause of all these things. Whether because, on account of her great emotion, she alters her bodily substance and the other things towards what she strives, or because on account of her dignity, the other lower things are subject to her. Anyway, he goes on. I won't read the entire thing. But the point is, Avicenna is saying, and Albertus Magnus is repeating, and Jung is repeating, is saying that this psychic energy, this libido, this power is behind magic. Think back to the episode with Freud and the bookshelf. Remember what I said? Jung describes as a sense as if his stomach had become a hot coal and he was ready to burst. And this is what comes out and actually impacts the external world. Jung here is trying to find a psychological explanation or a psychological reflection on what is essentially a magical process. No more big walls of text. 1957. Indeed, as I know from my own experience and that of other investigators, magic as practiced in the Middle Ages and much remoter times has by no means died out, but still flourishes today as rampantly as it did centuries ago. One doesn't speak of these things, however. They simply happen, and the intellectuals know neither themselves nor people as they really are. So you take this into account a little bit. He's actually calling himself out a bit, because what has he been trying to do all his life? He's trying to be the intellectual, the empiricist. And he's realizing that that's not sufficient. That's not enough in itself to be able to understand what it is to be human. So just to kind of summarize things, I've brought some of these under the headings that I'll call Jung's magical lessons. First, magic begins where comprehension ends. Magic is a relationship, not a technique. Images are magical power, libido, energy, transformative fire. Magic requires sacrifice, specifically the sacrifice of solace. And I put in parentheses here, certainty. Because as he has further conversations with Philemon about this, he realizes that the sacrifice is the idea of things being constant, the idea of things being predictable. Look at the dichotomy again. Jung's trying to be the empiricist, the scientist. What does the scientific method do? The scientific method takes careful measurements, as careful measurements can be taken, and predicts from that further phenomena. And what's the motivation behind that? If we understand something, we think we can control it. At the very least, we can wrap our head around it, right? And feel like, we possess it. We are in charge. Taking it further, yes, we can cloud seed because we want rain. But what Jung had to learn was that magic doesn't work that way. And if you're going to access and understand magic, you have to be willing to set aside that desire for certainty, to set aside that scientific empirical aspect of this. That's tougher than it sounds. I have taught research methods to undergraduates and graduates, and there are certain types of research that are in the scientific method. There are certain types that are not. They're really about understanding people's deep experience. Time after time after time, I don't think I've ever had a class where at least one individual, usually a young man, raises his hand and says, but how can that be knowledge? Because we live in a culture where the only knowledge is what's scientifically proven. And that's not a sufficient way to understand human life. In research, we call that qualitative, quantitative, as in bean counting. The other kind of research we call qualitative. And magic is a qualitative science, if you will. Emotion is the engine of magic. Finding magic brings together what consciousness keeps apart. The magician brings opposites together in their primeval state. So Philemon insisted that magic requires letting go of reason's grip, a natural quality of older persons, and Jung's own arc follows this movement. From 1902 to 1913, he's observing magic from the outside. From then to the 1930s, he's learning a psychological structure for magic and expressing a whole lot of doubt. 1930s to 1961, when he passes, he's acknowledging the ongoing reality of magic in human life and understanding that this is not something that's disappearing. This is something that is part of being human. In the end, Jung became the magician Philemon described, one who no longer tries to comprehend magic, but collaborates with the psyche that performs it. Thank you. Any questions, comments?
Yes.
Yes.
There was a question a little earlier online.
Okay.
Can you speak more about symbols, images, expression to active magic?
Sure. So in teaching active imagination, Jung told of one of his clients that he instructed, and it's a really good example. This particular patient would take a train every morning to go to work. And for some reason, there was a travel poster in the train station that captured his attention every time he saw it. It's a picture of beautiful Swiss hills. There's cattle in front, and something draws him to it. It is got his attention, and he can't figure out why. Jung says, here's what you do. You go there, and you look at this, and you begin to imagine yourself in that scene. And you begin to have an exchange. You begin to listen. So the man does this, and he ends up traveling. He goes over these hills. What's there? What's the mystery? What is so attractive? And he actually has this amazing experience with a Madonna figure. This idea of the divine feminine. So, this is a way of engaging. When I work with students, I teach active imagination in combination with dreaming. and working with our dream figures. When we have a dream that is drawing our attention, one way we can bring that out further and open that up further is to actually have a meditative, if you will, conversation with one of those dream figures. So, for example, coming back from Egypt, I have, in the last week and a half now, most nights experienced a teacher in my dreams that keeps wanting to show me things about ancient Egypt. Not just talk about it, but show, like time travel. I have not taken the time to work those dreams yet. But if I did, I would sit down in a meditative state, a trance state, if you will, and I would engage that teacher figure. I would have a conversation with that teacher figure. And what this does from a psychological aspect, it's a way of tapping into your own unconscious. And you can learn a whole lot about yourself in this way. On a bigger scale, though, it is something collective that you're tapping into. Give you another example. My doctoral dissertation was working with 36,000-year-old cave art in Chauvet Cave in France. This art is in an obvious ritual context, and yet we know very little about these people, about their stories. As part of my dissertation, I did active imagination with certain images from the cave. And I can tell you, particularly, well, funny story. At first, I just did active imagination in a very, kind of no frills way. There's different ways to enter into it. By the time I worked with the last image I was working with, I had this sort of overwhelming sense that I needed to not just do ordinary active imagination, but invoke the spirits that were connected with that image. And the image was what they call a Venus figure, a goddess figure, if you will, coupled with a man wearing a bison head mask. In invoking whatever spirits were connected with this image of the bison-headed man came forward. He came forward as a threshold guardian. He proceeded to basically give me a tour of what to see and what the significance of the image was, and an insight into what this may have looked like anciently. Does that mean I time traveled? No. Does it mean I'm able to tap into something? Yes. And so it becomes useful. Active imagination is usually paired with what's called amplification, which means we take the results of active imagination and we look for parallels in mythology, story, fairy tales, legends. And we see other people's rituals, and we see where these things mirror. So, for example, one of Jung's patients in a mental hospital was very excited to point to the sun outside one of the windows and tell all about how the sun had a giant phallus, and the phallus was swinging left to right with the wind. Of course, Jung and all the staff are like, okay, they think this is just little bizarre, right? Jung later on finds a particular tribe which absolutely teaches that the sun has a phallus and that its movement actually moves the weather. So these are things that were this individual, and because of mental illness, frankly, had a little less of a barrier to get into these things, was able to picture something that was collective, that he could not have had any personal experience to. I teach an entire course on active imagination and dreams, so that is my very quick Reader's Digest for those of us who are old and understand the reference. Yes.
Can you do active imagination with methods of Solomonic spirit evocation involving a black meaning, etc.?
Yes. I would even argue that you cannot avoid active imagination in that sort of indication. There's a debate in the magical community about whether the spirits that we invoke are objective, self-existent beings, or whether they are aspects of the psyche. And as a Jungian, I say yes, because we cannot have any interaction that does not involve the psyche, that does not involve a level of our own imagination. If I meet you, I form certain impressions of you, most of which have nothing to do with you, most of which are reflections of me that I see in you. They probably have almost no relationship with how you see yourself. They probably have almost no relationship from how anybody else in the room sees you. So as we engage in spirit invocation and such, we are engaging that spirit through our own filters. And part of our visual experience there, or our imaginal experience, if you will, is projection, is being able to encounter that spirit in a way that we can grasp and understand. So yeah, there's a very fine line here. I do not believe we can engage in spirit invocation without the use of the imaginal faculty. And if you get into some, Kabbalistic writings and such, the ancient Hebrew prophets, for example, are essentially using active imagination in their visions. It is a process. We
Just say imaginal faculty.
Yes, I did.
Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Okay. Well, fancy way of saying our ability to create images in our
I mean,
minds.
like our phantasmal apparatus.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. The imaginal gets a bad rap, and this largely goes back to
Luther.
yes, I was going to say
Oh.
largely goes back to the Reformation in England, because what did they do? They started busting down all the images within the Catholic Church. They decided the images were a problem. And that doesn't just end up a matter of idolatry questions. It grows into a distrust of the imagination. It grows into a sense that anything that comes up in the mind cannot be trusted and cannot be taken seriously. It contributes to our situation today where, again, people will say the scientific method is the only way to find truth, because they've laid aside these other ways of knowing that, by the way, continue in indigenous populations and many other groups, because they have not lost the understanding that there are many ways of acquiring knowledge. Please.
So this is definitely a beginner question.
Mhm.
My understanding of the scientific method is pretty simple
Mhm.
in that you are looking for reproducible results
Exactly.
when applying the same methods
Mhm.
to receive them, to
Mhm.
get that reproducible result. And so how does that differ from what anyone would do in these invocations and rituals when you're applying these same methods and expect it sounds like from your lecture that the idea is that the result will always be different, but it seems like in searching for the result that you're getting in fairy tales and histories and things like that, you're trying to also see if there is maybe some reproducibility there.
Right.
How is there? I guess I don't get it.
Great question.
Thank you.
And I this is something I should have clarified when I was talking about amplification.
Sure.
Because what you're doing is looking on a collective level instead of a personal level. There's a personal unconscious and there's a collective unconscious. Jung described the collective unconscious as a 2 million year old man with all of the memories of human existence at their fingertips. So when we do active imagination, obviously there is a very real risk that we are just screwing with ourselves. That we are just dealing with our own material. Amplification looks for the patterns. Jung actually compared it to, and I'm going to say it wrong, philology, the study of language. And, if you go online, you can find these really intricate, fascinating charts where, this language stems from this language. And we can see this word shows up in 10 different languages in very close ways because they all trace back here. That, of course, is, anthropologically, it is explained as absolute contact and passing things on. But that is it's still a comparison here, because what we are doing is saying, okay, here's what I saw. So, example, doing the work on the cave. There is a stalactite that fell off the top of the cave roof and actually, by its weight, crushed into the ground of the cave. It creates a flat top like an altar. And in this cave, there are a lot of skeletons from cave bears. Somebody 36,000 years ago took the skull of a cave bear and very carefully centered it on that makeshift pedestal with its fangs hanging over. And then there are bits of charcoal underneath where they are either giving it light from within or perhaps burning incense. When I did active imagination with that image, what came forward was the idea that people were using this as an invocation tool, that it was a spirit or a god speaking to them, and that certain people among the tribe, if you will, could interpret that, could hear that, could convey it to the others. Okay? That's what comes up, unbidden in that. So I go and start doing amplification. What do I find? Oracular skulls are a long-standing tradition, and at the time I did not know this, by the way. But we've been treating skulls, human skulls, magically for thousands of years, and so what I had come up had parallels in multiple cultures. That tells me that what I pictured there, whether or not it was anything accurate about Paleolithic practice, does tap into something collective on a larger human scale. Does that help make sense a little bit? Okay. Yeah.
And also, like, the scientific method is specifically for testing and measuring empirical phenomena,
yes,
and not for non-empirical phenomena.
Right.
Like, you can't necessarily apply the scientific method in fields where things are not falsifiable or things are not measurable with scientific instrumentation. I mean, if we find a way to measure imagination, then we can apply the scientific method.
Try to scientifically study love.
That has happened.
If it has, but what have they done? They've measured brain waves.
Yeah, and hormones.
But that's not love.
No.
So from those who want to get very strident about this scientific empirical view, ask them if love exists, because it cannot be proven. It is not falsifiable. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, imagination is the same way, because imagination from an empirical standpoint is entirely subjective.
Yep.
Like, nobody in this room can prove that anybody else in the room has imagination.
Right. Yeah, very true. I will point out, though, and I'm not going to quote it correctly, so I won't quote it. Somebody else certainly can. Steve probably can. Crowley talked about applying scientific methods to magic.
Oh, right.
Not in the sense that, you can count beans, but in the sense of keep your diary, keep all the conditions, pay attention to the patterns, pay attention to what's going on, and learn from it and apply it.
That comes from what is it?
The method of science.
Yes.
The aim of religion.
The aim of the religion.
Thank you.
The method of
I was
science,
remembering the method of science, and I couldn't come up with the other part.
I have a question.
Sure.
Did Jung ever read or get exposed to the ideas of Giordano Bruno?
Yes.
Really?
Yep.
And we have records of that?
Jung's output of writing is phenomenal.
Oh, yeah.
Give you an example. The so-called collected works of Jung were published back in the 60s and 70s, and comprises 22 volumes. That said, the Jung Institute in Zurich is still, Philemon Society actually, is still uncovering and translating Jung's materials.
Mm-hmm.
So there's plenty more that has not come out. The Red Book did not come out until 2009.
Right. Yeah, but I'm just wondering, like, Bruno was only available in like maybe Latin and Italian and not frequently just in manuscript form during his lifetime. Like, but we know that he
Jung became an avid collector of manuscripts, particularly alchemy, but that overflows into other areas, Kabbalah, Magick. He had a first original 3 books of occult philosophy, for example.
It feels like some of his approach to imagination and images and that kind of stuff echoes Bruno from De Umbris Idearum and De Magia.
Yeah,
a little bit.
Yeah, and I do recall him citing Bruno at some point in his works. I couldn't pinpoint it for you off the top of my head. But yeah, the man was a voracious student of multiple cultures and of many of these early thinkers. And he brings them forward with a psychological lens, but isn't always coming up with something new. Synchronicity was not that new.
It was a new word.
It's a new word. It's a psychological lens on a magical concept that we've known of for centuries. Please.
What do you think about the word association experiment as a bridge between unconscious phenomena and scientific collection?
As it happens, Jung was very involved in the word association experiments early in his career, and they were part of actually what led to his theories of archetypes and complexes. Most of us, or many of us, I should say, know what an archetype is. We have like the archetype of the mother or the archetype of the magician. A complex is our individual experience of that archetype. So, for example, my mother was a beast. She had some mental illness problems, and she was a sadistic narcissist. So I have a mother complex that is not particularly pretty because of my life experience. Somebody else in this room may have had an absolutely glorious, wonderful mother, and their mother complex will be very different. But the archetype, Jung said, is like irrigation ditches. It may lie dry, but when the waters of life flow, they're going to flow into those categories, those divisions.
So the latency in the experiment is probably more associated than empathy.
Yeah. So yeah, he really particularly comes up with the idea of complexes from it. But yeah, it was a very significant part of his early work.
Was that his hang up? Like he had to prove this, he couldn't talk about the tension between the two the scientist and the artist. Was this his hang up to feel like he had it?
Well, certainly to attack things from an empirical standpoint, yes. This again was early in his medical career, his psychological career, and it was kind of a thing to be doing, right? Thing to study. He's not alone in doing the word association experiments. He just happens to draw this sort of theory from them. And yeah, there's some good records about it and really fascinating things that he is drawing from the words and images that people come forward with.
They make us do it. I'm a student in Zurich.
We have to. I'm jealous.
We have to do
wow. Okay, yeah, I'm jealous. Yeah, dear friend of mine, Elizabeth. I'm not gonna say. I never say her last name right. Longerberger, something like that.
She's in charge of the picture archive.
Yes, she is. Dear friend of mine, very dear friend of mine, and she was telling me that she's doing some work, particularly on those experiments. So yeah, cool, small world. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, we're just going to make a comment. You were talking about the active imagination. Liz Green, who is an astrologer and Jungian, she says that active imagination, Jung was actually inspired from, his active imagination was inspired by the Neoplatonist philosopher magicians of antiquity.
Mhm.
And they used imagination as their medium to, in ritual, as the medium to create an encounter between the human and the divine, a transformative encounter that would free them from the astral compulsions of fate.
That's theurgy and like the idea of like ascending
Yeah.
ascending through the
Exactly.
spheres and the corpus medicums.
Yeah.
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 And that influence
Yeah.
continued into writings of his day as well.
Writings of his,
Of his day,
yes.
you know,
absolutely.
things that were currently being
Uh-huh.
written.
Absolutely. He was
Absolutely.
so influenced. To me, I
Yeah.
just, to me, that was just like, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to
Had
realize
so much
some
in
of what Jung did was repackaging
Yes, that's,
what we might call mystical ideas into a psychological lens. And that was an important part of his work.
it was.
Unfortunately, what happens today is we have a lot of people in the world who know a little bit about Jung and decide that he is a new age guru. And they will misquote him, they will twist his words to come up with their own thought patterns. One that amuses me is all these groups that say you need to overcome the ego. And they say that this is from Jung. No. Jung taught the ego is an absolutely essential part of the psyche and would absolutely come unglued if somebody accused him of saying you needed to kill the ego, this sort of thing. So, yeah.
You mentioned when you were working with the skull,
Yes.
you mentioned doing amplification.
Mhm.
What does that mean?
So amplification is looking at stories, myth, fairy tales, legends, other sources, particularly those that are sort of timeless, rituals of other cultures, to see where there are parallels.
Okay, like
So-
studying like other sources to kind of match everything up.
Yeah. So if I were studying languages and I wanted to understand the meaning of a word more thoroughly, I might look at where that word comes from, where there are parallel, similar words, and I draw from these a better understanding.
Okay,
Of
so
what
it's
the
just
word
broadening
means.
your perspective
It is.
using like a lot of different sources.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
That
And
makes sense.
this is a way of taking what you're doing into a collective realm instead of just navel gazing.
That makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. In its own way, sure, for sure. Anybody else with comments or questions I can help with? Anybody else online? Oh, please.
This comes up as a topic for me and for others, you yourself also. There's sort of a colonialist aspect to Jungian work at times. Where
Mhm.
we disavow or don't acknowledge the indigenous people or our various ancestral lines. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are, frankly, that European Jungians are a little more sticking their heels, dragging their heels in the dirt, and are very wedded to some of Jung's original thoughts instead of moving Jungian theory forward. Whereas Western scholars and analysts are actively moving it forward. For example, Jung's idea of the anima and the animus, the idea that the man has a feminine aspect of the psyche, a woman has a masculine aspect of the psyche. Totally gender essentialist, very heteronormative. We have a different understanding today. So modern Jungian scholars understand that everybody has both. And so there are many ways like this that we are moving forward. I am part of the Jungian Society. I'm on the board of the Jungian Society for Scholarly Studies. And part of the work we actively do is presenting the work of various backgrounds and cultures, various communities, particularly marginalized communities, with a very intentional desire to course correct some of those patterns. We don't jump up and down and condemn Jung. It's not useful. And it's, he was of a different time and place. That's just the reality. However, we also recognize, this was fucking racist.
Yeah.
It's not okay. if I walked into a Jungian conference and started talking about Black people as primitive, it would not be pretty. I mean, I would, as much as people try to be very polite and supportive in conferences, something like that, I would get my tail handed to me, and rightly so.
Yeah, try to use they, them with a room full of Germans. So they respond to that. They don't linguistically, it's not constructive.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, I identify as non-binary. I use they, them pronouns. And look at me. If I was going to have a fit every time somebody used masculine pronouns about me, I would spend an awful lot of time angry, and I'm not willing to do that. So.
You mentioned at the beginning of your talk, you talked about Jung's encounter with soul, but he must have gendered soul.
Yes, he did.
What word did he use?
Anima. This is
He
actually,
had a
which, yeah. So this is the core of his idea of anima and animus, because soul, anima, in this case, is the feminine in his own psyche, and he has some troubling interactions with anima that actually reflect his own interactions with women.
Oh,
Remember, his mother made him super nervous.
sounds very Freudian.
Yeah. Would Philemon be the Emma's part of his soul? What character would?
Wait, wasn't Philemon a real person? I was.
He's a
No.
fiction.
No.
It pre-existing fiction.
Oh.
Philemon and Bacchus go back into a legend. Short version. They entertained Jupiter and Mercury unaware of who they were, and fed them like their last goose, etc. These gods revealed who they were and transformed Philemon and Bacchus's little hut into a golden temple. So
That happened to me once.
and remember that Jung is obsessed with Faust. In the Faust legend, when Faust is building his utopian community, he's really pissed off because he's been building these beautiful homes for everybody, making everything great, except for there's this one old couple who won't sell their fucking hut. And it's Philemon and Bacchus. And he finally tells his own soldiers, look, I've prepared a house for them. They just need to move on. Go and make this happen. Remove them. And the henchmen, if you will, end up lighting the place on fire. And Bacchus and Philemon die in the flames. So Philemon, in that sense, stands large. Is it the same figure? No, it's a name. However, Philemon does have a wife named Bacchus in the Red Book. It's just largely the names.
I had forgotten that story.
No problem.
When you were mentioning it earlier, I was sort of like, oh, you actually met a dude named Philemon. That's weird.
I have a teddy bear named Philemon.
I've got a teddy bear named Bacchus.
Okay.
The Red Book,
Yes.
Is there a character that seems like it would probably be his animus archetype?
So the animus in Jung's original thinking is the masculine aspect of a woman's psyche.
Right, but you're saying
and vice versa, the anima is the feminine aspect of a man's psyche.
But if you're saying people have both,
Right.
what character do you think would most likely?
That's a really good question. I would tend to say, if you study what has been said about the animus in women, it tends to be around the father figure and the hero figure. And
Why I would guess Philemon would be my gut instinct on duty.
he's not really either. He really is the magician archetype. Jung, in broader terms, would call him the archetype of the wise old man. So it's a wisdom keeper. Senex, yes.
Are the magician and the Senex the same?
No.
Okay.
Senex is the old man. Puer is the young man. And as you study in these things, great illustration is Zeus and Ganymede. they become lovers. Zeus needs the energy and life of Ganymede, who's much younger. Ganymede needs the structure and wisdom of Zeus. So there has to be actually a balance of senex and puer. Problem comes when we get very rigid, as many people do in old age in our culture. Way too much senex without the puer to temper that. We also see, a lot of young adults who will not grow up. Marie-Louise von Franz, who is one of Jung's close collaborators, called that the problem of the puer aeternus. Peter Pan, the boy who will not grow up to be a man. We could get into Jungian theory for hours and hours. But thank you all so much for your attention tonight and for being here. And I look forward to coming and talking with you again sometime.